Godin, what's your status?
Paralysis.
Paralysis?
Paralyzed with inaction when I see your beautiful face.
I'm gonna pretend that I didn't hear that.
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, Monster Hunter Wilds is one of the most unusual games in the mainline series, more than anything for how it has treated the post-release content and how they've really just created this massive difference between normal monsters in their base versions and the hardest versions of those same monsters in the game, especially the 9-star tempered versions of the ones that do have that. And one of the biggest casualties of this whole thing is something I find quite sad and something that I want to discuss, which is statuses. Today I'm going to talk about why statuses are sort of dead as of this point in Wilds. We'll talk about what I think that they could do to avoid this happening in a Master Rank expansion or just any future Monster Hunter if it was something the devs didn't want to happen, and I'll explain what I mean by that too, of course. First up then, we did a quite deep dive on how statuses work early in the life cycle of Wilds in the base game, and at that time they were genuinely worth using because of the Artian weapon system. At that point, Element hadn't quite become good enough to justify making 5 different Artian weapons and maximizing them out, at least not for most of the weapon types. And so, if you were only going to focus on one Artian weapon, the best bang for your buck was generally a status, with the two most popular of them being Blast for straight up damage, being like 150 damage per proc, or Paralysis for long periods of downtime on the monster, especially monsters that were particularly weak to a certain status, like Zhuwu being unbelievably poison weak was a fantastic example of how poison, which isn't great against most monsters in the game, was actually really good for Zhuwu specifically. And then Sleep was of course great for things like Greatsword that could use it for free massive wake-up hits, and I'd argue that that being the most synergistic version of status use that we had, and the fact that even that concept has been pretty much abandoned by Greatsword users should show that something is not right with statuses right now. So let's get into the details on that. The first major thing is just the existence of 9-star monsters and how they actually work. For our first comparison, let's take Arkveld, regular base version of Arkveld, and compare him to Gogmazios, and we'll use Blast status specifically for our regular number of comparisons, but this generally applies in similar ways to all statuses. Regular 7-star Arkveld has around 22,000 health, and Gogmazios has around 410,000 health. Whether you are solo or support hunters or multiplayer, doesn't matter for Gog. This means that Gogmazios has approximately 18.6 times the regular amount of health that Arkveld has. Blast still does the same amount of damage per proc to regular Arkveld though, as it does to Gogmazios. So the ratio of damage provided by Blast is way lower compared to Gogmazios' actual health. And funnily enough, they actually have the same exact status thresholds between them for Blast 2, which is 70 threshold for the first Blast proc, increased by 30 for each proc up to a maximum threshold of 670. This means that even with them having no difference in Blast proc frequency, even if that was the same length of quest for whatever reason, Blast itself is weaker because it's a lower percentage of the monster's health pool being done by the status, even if the actual numbers that pop up are the same. In essence, status itself has not really scaled past how it was on release, but monsters are scaling, and damage from raw and from elements have been scaling too, and so status is just sort of being heavily left behind. You might be saying, whoa, wait a second, Gogmazios is quite a bit of an anomaly, he has insane health because he's forcibly fought with support hunters and with the Elder Breaker and stuff like that, so maybe we should do a more direct comparison. So let's take 9-star, 5-star tempered Arkveld compared to normal Arkveld. 9-star, 5-star Arkveld has around 48,000 health, so around 2.2 times the amount that regular Arkveld has. If you were to have identical status thresholds, that would mean that in essence, Blast would at best be 50% as effective against him as it is against regular Arkveld. But it gets much worse than that because the thresholds are much steeper for 9-star tempered monsters, and for Arkveld, again, the base monster Arkveld is 70 threshold for the first Blast proc, then the threshold goes up by 30 each time, up to a maximum of 670. For 9-star tempered Arkveld, it is 84 for the first proc, which isn't too much worse, but then it goes up by 90 for every subsequent proc, so the threshold growth is triple that of base Arkveld, and at least as far as I'm aware, there's no threshold cap for the 9-star tempered status threshold gain either, so you are unlikely to get more status procs even with the extra hunt length, and in a lot of cases you will actually have less procs against a 9-star tempered monster than the base version of that monster, despite the fact that Blast will still be dealing 150 damage when it procs regardless of which version of the monster you're fighting. And so Blast, which was good for base game monsters early endgame late story, is now just completely irrelevant compared to even a small amount of value from element on your weapon instead. Well, how about Paralysis then? Regular base arkveld is 180 threshold for the first Paralysis, increased by 130 each proc up to a maximum of 960 threshold, which to be clear is quite a lot. You're not going to reach that final Paralysis. In builds that had Paralysis weapons, but without focusing your whole build around them, you used to get around 4 Paralysis on base game monsters before you finished a quest. For 9-star tempered arkveld, he has 360 base threshold, so double for his first proc, and then it goes up by a whopping 780 for every proc after that, which is 6 times the threshold growth rate of base arkveld's Paralysis threshold. As a result, a lot of footage in this video is me hunting 9-star arkveld with a build that has a artian weapon built around Paralysis, and even using 3 Paralysis attack as one of my weapon skills too, and throughout the entire hunt, I got 3 Paralysis before he died. You could argue that Paralysis technically does scale a bit better into the deeper endgame because the damage reward for it is from your own build. It is relative to your character's power, it's not damage tied to the status itself, but if you are getting less Paralysis procs per hunt, and the monster's health pool is bigger, then the value of Paralysis is simply decreasing compared to the base game. The deeper into the endgame we get, the more behind statuses are falling, and it's something that was intentionally done when they created the parameters for 9-star monsters. Not even just the fact that statuses haven't really improved much on their own, it's the fact that they made them harder to apply on purpose. As for poison was only ever really decent against like 4 monsters, and now it's sort of abysmal. Against most monsters, which are 2-star poison weakness, it does 300 damage each time it is triggered. Poison is a unique status in that you can build up poison while the monster is already poisoned, but you still have to apply poison buildup one more time after it ends to begin the next one, even if you already met the threshold. As a result, it isn't hard to have high poison uptime against things that have proper poison weakness, but that's again only a few monsters. With 2-star poison weakness, even a fully poison focused setup would get somewhere around 70% poison uptime in the base game, depending on the monster specifically, and now especially if we are talking about 9-star tempered monsters, you're lucky to hit like 40% uptime, even focusing on poison. And to be clear, the damage does not go up. It is still 300 damage per full length of poison duration. So even if you were to get 10 poisons, which is a lot of poison procs, that would be 3000 damage, which is such a minor amount compared to the 9-star tempered monster health pools. For sleep, same problem, just build up threshold skyrocketing with 9-star tempered monsters, and more HP also means longer hunts, which means less relative value from the wake up hits that you get in comparison to their total health. The result of this is status is all but dead in proper endgame of wilds. You can make some potent status builds with endgame equipment and then bring it to lower tier monsters and have some silly fun with it, but the actual meaningfully difficult hunts just go out of their way to punish statuses and incentivize element use instead. That said, moving on, I want to talk about the fact that this hasn't been the case every time we've reached endgame in a Monster Hunter. Quite often in Monster Hunter, status weapons are good in the early state of endgame, and then element just power creeps the hell out of it over time because of similar things to what we've been talking about with Wilds, but it happened in much lesser amounts in the 5th generation games. Wilds just has such a stark gap between the easiest monsters in the game to the hardest monsters in the game because of how they've treated the live service aspect. But there was an exception to this for a short period of time as well in Sunbreak, where statuses were actually arguable meta in the deeper endgame for a short period of time, which was after the release of Gold Rathian and her unique new skill called Status Trigger. This skill activated when you iframe through an attack, and when active it made status apply on every hit that you do, instead of only applying once every 3 hits, which is what it does by default. The result was essentially 3 times faster status buildup if you were good at iframing things, and this made statuses themselves way more potent. And it was really fun using that with Blast and Paralysis, but the real synergy came from using Poison with it, which you could then keep pretty much 95% or more uptime on due to Status Trigger as a skill, combined with the Foray skill, which is in Wild as well, increasing attack and affinity against poisoned or paralyzed monsters. If a monster is high enough poison uptime, Foray becomes better than Agitator in relative value, and that was the point that we were at for a short period of time in Sunbreak's endgame. The point being, it's essentially the result of Capcom designing a title update monster around statuses and wanting to make them stronger, and that worked. In Wilds, status has been left to rot on purpose. In Sunbreak, they made a purposeful choice to let it catch up for a little bit, but we haven't had that in Wilds. As a result, statuses as they currently work are just sort of designed to be good early and bad late, unless Capcom decides to release new skills that change it because they want a little bit of fun for that. And I think there's an argument to be made that it is very intentional, that they want statuses to be good earlier on, but then eventually outscaled by element builds later in the endgame too, because the difference differences in thresholds on difficult monsters is not an accidental choice, and that's always how Monster Hunter has worked. On top of that, specifically in relation to blast and poison, they do flat damage, and I think that in itself sort of shows how they want statuses to be viewed. Making statuses do flat damage automatically makes them stronger the lower the maximum health of the monster is. This means they are stronger against easy monsters and weaker against herd monsters. That is a design choice of how statuses work as a base function. If you wanted to make statuses stronger, you wouldn't do that. You would make it deal a percentage of the monster's maximum health. Let's say for blast, instead of 150 damage, it was 0.7% of a monster's maximum health when procced. For base arkveld at 22,000 health, that would make blast be 154 damage, which is nearly identical to what it is right now. But for 9-star tempered arkveld, who has 48,000 health, that would make a blast proc to 336 damage. This would, in itself, even outside of threshold meddling, make blast scale properly compared to monsters' actual health pools, and you could do the exact same thing with poison if you wanted to as well, just make it scale off of maximum health. And I'm sure that Capcom is fully aware that they could do this if they wanted statuses to be relevant in the deeper parts of endgame. But at this point, the fact that they haven't, I think it's just not what the developers want. They don't want status to be that. They want status to be good early and bad late. That said, status isn't going to be dead forever, and master rank the damage of blast and poison procs will go up by default because it is built to do that. And so blast and poison will likely be relevant damage in early game and base endgame for the expansion, and status thresholds will likely be even easier to reach than they are with 9-star tempered monsters right now. As well, there's always a chance that the developers overcompensate a little bit and make status much stronger for master rank than it is right now because of people talking about how weak it is, and then it might even stay relevant for much longer. But I think outside of unique moments like a whole new status related skill being created in Sunbreak, one which, by the way, I would love to see return in the expansion for Wilds, I would love to see status trigger, it would make statuses stay relevant, but outside of that, status is simply intended to not be the optimal damage route in deep endgame for Monster Hunter. For now, status is dead, and that's not an accident. It's because they want status to be dead. That's pretty much it for today then, everyone. A discussion about the state of statuses in Monster Hunter Wilds after Title Update 4, and the sort of rise and fall of statuses in the endgame progression, and what our chances are of some sort of status renaissance in the expansion. I am really hopeful that they make a point of making statuses stronger. It's not something as simple as like a single numbers tweak, and it's something they have to actually like intentionally want, but I hope that it happens. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, everyone, and let me know your own thoughts on statuses in Wilds down below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.